Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Interpreting for Healthcare, the monthly podcast sponsored by the National Council on Interpreting for Healthcare and brought to you by the Standards and Training Committee. Every podcast is always intended for you, our members, and anyone in the public at large who works to promote language access as well as social justice. Join our conversations with some of the best in the field and hear what they have to say about interpreting for healthcare. Today, I'm so happy to bring to you a very special guest occupying a very special role that I really hope to see expand to all 50 states. So without any further ado, let me tell you about our guest. Margarita Larios is the Executive Director of the Office of Language Access for the state of New York. There, she oversees, coordinates, and guides all state agencies covered by the state's language access law. Before joining OGS, Margarita served as the Director of Operations and Language Services for New York City Health and Hospitals, the largest public healthcare system in the country. During her tenure, her team expanded and optimized the healthcare system's delivery of high-quality language services available 24/7 in more than 200 languages and dialects through innovative solutions such as the creation of a language services usage dashboard and the implementation of an interpreter skills training for bilingual staff. Margarita is an experienced translator and trained interpreter. She also taught courses on professional translation at Brooklyn College and has worked with various media outlets to manage transcreation projects and multilingual website operations in the public and private sectors. In 2016, she received the Innovation Award from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene for her contributions as the founding translation manager for the agency's language access unit. Kudos. Margarita received her BA in Latin American literature from the Universidad Iberoamericana Ciudad de Mexico and her Master of Fine Arts from New York University. So yay, thank you for coming and agreeing to be in our podcast. You may not know Margarita, but I lived 17 years in New York City and my kids were born and raised and graduated from high school there. So a very special place in my heart. Very proud that New York State is leading the way. So welcome and let's jump in.
Thank you so much for having me over, Eliana. I can't tell you what a pleasure and what an honor it is to join you in the series of podcasts that are really just so wonderful in highlighting the incredible work that your team is doing and also other practitioners in the field, right? I'm so happy that we get to live in this point in time where we're seeing the fruit, as you and I have talked about before, of so much work in language access field for many years. Now we're starting to see even more fruits from it, and it's becoming a more visible and for lack of a better word, popular field where folks are starting to get interested and we're getting a lot of allyship. That other parts of social justice, I think, have also started to see a lot more of. So I'm delighted to be here with you today, especially knowing that New York has a special place in your heart.
Yes, if you can make it there, then you can show the rest of us how to make it anywhere, right?
Or at least try.
So before we talk about what you're doing now, I'd like to take a look back and see how you ended up here. What changed your life to make you end up here? Or what are you most proud of when you look back? Or what was that pivotal moment?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. It's hard to answer it from a very personal perspective. Hearing other guests of yours that have such great stories too. And I figured I would tell it starting with the personal level, and I'll say that I was fortunate enough. I grew up in Mexico City, and my family was always very supportive of how I am, who I am. My parents were always very much cultivating my sisters and my identities in different ways. And I think I've always been a very creative person. And, I didn't hear this in my generation a lot, where folks really had the support to pursue anything like writing, right? When you come to your parents and you say, I want to be a writer, there's immediate panic, probably, right? So when I started with, pursuing what I really wanted, which now I see is really just creativity through language, they were super supportive. And that was something that, as you mentioned earlier in my bio, I pursued in Mexico City. And then as soon as I was done with my undergrad, I figured, well, what's going to happen next, right? Like the day that I was graduating, I was like, I need to figure out what's going on next. And I had been wanting to continue to explore the creative writing part of the work. I studied literature, actually, and then I wanted to shift it more into creating things. And so, I started giving it a shot. And I think that's the thing, that's a summary of what I'm proud of for it, and it encompasses several things, and it's just giving it a shot. I feel like we're so used to telling ourselves, no, that can't happen, it's going to be too hard, or it's too risky, but anything that is worth it is risky and really scary, right? So I figured, you know what, let me give it a shot. And I have to say that, of course, you need to have a network and a system of support to be able to make those decisions, right? So I was fortunate enough to have that. And so I started looking at opportunities abroad. NYU happened for me for graduate school. So I came to New York City, specifically in New York State, of course, and just started, really opening my eyes in several directions, but specifically when it comes to even the diversity within the Spanish-speaking world, right? I remember one of my first conversations with other fellow graduate students. I was wondering, wait, that word means something completely different in Mexican Spanish, and that one, wait, that guagua means that for folks in the South Cone, So it was like this rediscovery of language, and through it of my identity too, right? I think that nothing has ever made me feel like more Mexican than those conversations, right? Like, because your language is so much your identity. So after that, it was a great experience. I really got to delve into my creative side. And then after that, I figured, because of also an opportunity that I have in my life, I stayed, I found a partner, and I started to build a life in New York City. So moved on through a couple of different professional opportunities, and one of the first interesting ones was something that again married that creative aspect of my personality or my identity with language, and it was a translation. It was translation services for a fashion forecasting company, which at the time I didn't know what that meant. I know, it was fascinating. And it actually ends up being that it's a mix of anthropology, like business analysis, data statistics to project what's coming up, right? It's like, as the name says, it forecasting. And that was a job that I really, really enjoyed. But I felt that I, wanted to do something more related to healthcare, because that's also something that's been part of my family. I come from a family of doctors, and at some point, I toyed with that possibility. I didn't go to med school, as we have discussed, but it's also something that's always been in my interest. Science has always been very interesting to me. And I got this opportunity at New York City's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene as an editorial project manager / translator. And again, it was one of those opportunities that for me was scary, because I was the first one doing that, right? It was the foundational role. They hadn't had someone doing full-time translations for DOHMH at that point, up until that point. So it was a great opportunity, but at the same time, it was like up to me what I was going to make of that role, So there weren't any confines, but there was a lot of weight with the responsibility for that. And I have to say that it has been one of the most wonderful opportunities I've had. And it really made me realize that public service is just it is obviously very demanding, but it's such a rewarding way to, use your skills and just like advance equity, I now in hindsight, I see the topic of all of that or the common factor. But at that time, I didn't quite know. I just knew, that I had linguistic skills, that I'm very creative, and that I was willing to give it a shot. After that, it seemed like a natural, progression of things to move into a role that was more kind of on a practitioner kind of level, I'll say, at New York City Health and Hospitals, that is a municipal healthcare system, the largest in the country. And the difference there was that it was almost immediate, the effect of one's work. I was there, started as the associate director for language access and health equity. And in comparison to what I was doing at DOHMH, which was more external affairs, like policy kind of, it was harder to see the effect of the work that we had, even though we would see it in subways and all that, right? But at Health and Hospitals, it was really a great opportunity for me to hone my operational skills, right? And one of those examples was the interpreter training program that you mentioned a little bit earlier, which another example of, I was like, how can we possibly, train 100 folks to become medical interpreters? How are we going to do this, right? So we're like, well, we should start small, right? Like we should start with a pilot. So I was like, all right, well, I need to know if this pilot works out. How can I make sure, right? And I was like, well, I have to do it myself. So I did. And it was honestly, again, one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. It was really hard. And if I already had so much respect for translators and interpreters before then, after taking that course, my gosh, like when you really see all the different roles that an interpreter needs to fulfill, and the amount of information, the agility, the ethics, like it's really just, I wish that it were the kind of thing that more people would know about, and that is certainly that's certainly my intent, to continue to promote the importance and the width and the breadth of the scope of becoming an interpreter, especially a medical interpreter, right? So that went great. It was the first cohort for that municipal healthcare system, and now it has expanded into additional languages after my departure there. But I'll say that just in terms of what I'm proud of, it's giving it a shot and coming to where I am now. I definitely think that some of that pride is definitely it's more gratitude, again, because I don't think that I would have even been able to get here without that support. And to now be in the place, like you said, we're leading in the language access space with the first office in continental US, the very first for the country, as we know, where our colleagues at the Office of Language Access in Hawaii, that is incredible and is doing such wonderful work, and who have been so supportive of me as well. I have to say that the director of the Office of Language Access at Hawaii has been such a wonderful colleague and inspiration and just source of information. And I think that's something that makes our work and the people that work in it so special. I have had the opportunity to work in different areas of social justice, like especially at Health and Hospitals. Really had the opportunity to work with disability access, LGBTQ rights, and I have to say that I think the cohorts in language access are just the people are so special in that they want to be transparent and share, and we're so collaborative, and I think that's hard to find in other areas. So that was a very long answer, Eliana, but I'm proud of giving it a shot, and in being here now is what I wanted to say.
A lot of it really resonates with me. It can be so disheartening when you find programs that people still don't understand, that not only is there a need for language access, but they have a responsibility by law to provide language access. And that's like still a new idea. My patience for that has worn thin. So I'm really glad to see the tightening and the updates to Section 1557, which brings us to the present. And I'll let you decide which way you want to go with this question. Currently, either what are you most excited about or
Mhm.
charged up about, or what do you see is the biggest challenge? And for me,
Mhm.
I see that stubborn persistence of it's before 1964 and we don't know about language access. But
And
I
I'll
don't
say
want to answer for you.
no, well, I mean, you can definitely suggest. I mean, I'll say, Eliana, that I think those at the end of the road, they come together, right? What I'm most excited about and what the biggest challenge is for me these days. As you very well put it, it's taken so many years to get to where we are now. But I do think it is so important for us to take a moment and recognize the strides that have been taken. Never to say, okay, we're done and that's it, but just to say, look how much we can actually accomplish, right? Like, look what a difference we can make. So, for context, for those who are listening, the New York State had executive orders 26 and 26.1 that required translation initially into 6 languages and then expanded into 10. And then last year, Governor Hochul codified the language access policy into law. Now, Section 202-A, the language access law for New York State, has several requirements. Among them, expanded the languages that are required for translation to 12 languages. There's also the requirement to provide interpretation services in any language with respect to the services or benefits that the members of the public are receiving from the agencies covered under this law, as well as having a language access coordinator designated and a language access plan. Our office, the Office of Language Access, which is housed within the Office of General Services in New York State, has been commissioned with overseeing that that law is implemented effectively and efficiently, right? That's how our office launched in October of 2022. And, in the last 5-6 months, we've been super busy really assessing what do we need to be able to be most useful to the 45 currently agencies covered under the law. These are agencies that provide public services directly to the public, and that I have been delighted to see that their language access coordinator is so invested. Like, these agencies certainly feel the passion and the importance in the work that language access entails, but beyond that, right? Because I think that the work that we've been doing until now can certainly fall under language access. Where we're going and the big challenge is language justice, to get to a point where we're really creating a culture where folks understand things like the difference between a translator and an interpreter, or someone who communicates directly, right? Yes. And just for it to be, again, for lack of a better term, a cool topic. Like, we definitely need the allies that have helped us get here, and just for people to get interested, because language is in everyone's lives, right? It is such a deep part of who we are and how we navigate life. And of course, that can be a huge barrier to folks, right? And we obviously all understand that in the language access world, but beyond the confines, it doesn't often get prioritized. And I think you want to chime in about that, Eliana, yeah?
Yeah, even with places that get it and are doing a great job in the sense that they actually say a healthcare system, the major hospital or the level 1 trauma center has staff interpreters. And they contract with agencies for the languages that are requested less often that they don't have staff for. And they have a contract to provide remote interpreting. All of these things are great. But when the patient has an issue and calls the hospital, time and time again, they run into that phone tree that's all in English. For one, press 1 for general information, press 2 if you want the financial office. And you're just trying to figure out what to do because you ran out of medicines, or somebody who was released from the hospital suddenly has a fever that you don't know whether you should come in or not. how do I get through? Like the phone tree is the downfall of many a well thought out
Mhm.
system.
Mhm.
And it seems so
Yeah.
basic. So sometimes it can be frustrating to try and stick your finger in all the holes in the dike, so to speak, which is why I'm so glad we have this podcast, which is why I'm so glad you have a chance to speak and others like you,
Mhm.
because language access is not just interpreters and translators. And we need people leading departments, leading agencies, leading ministries that get
Mhm.
it, so that comes, I guess we attack it from both ends, because from the worker bee end, we have been struggling for a long time. And now that we have an administration that seems to understand the need for having a well thought out process rolled out for providing service, for accrediting certifications, for vetting continuing education, requiring that to maintain certification. All of these things are coming together to help make it be, I think, a more seamless thing. But boy, sometimes, we stub our toe right at the beginning, which is, how do I speak to somebody at the hospital? How do I call?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think you touch upon something so important, and that it is, like you said, that oftentimes we figure out the theoretical part of it, but not the implementation of it. And there's no way of learning how to implement something until you actually start implementing it. Of course, you need to do it in a controlled environment and as small as you can, so that you can figure out the sweet spot between a small sample but also significant enough so that you can learn for a bigger cohort. For example, thinking again of the medical interpreter training for bilingual staff. But I think another big challenge that we face is, like you said, not necessarily always having the resources to prioritize this work, right? Like I hadn't seen until, in the recent years, the level of interest in the language access work, but also the support that we're getting from different areas and areas that are important to amplify our voices, right? Like obviously this office would not exist without the governor prioritizing language access as an area of work that requires its own office, and are having the support and the resources necessary to do that work by being housed at the Office of General Services, and having really the unwavering support of our Commissioner Jeanette Moy. So I think you mentioned something that is really important, and it is that just like with other diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we are prioritizing it. It's center front, but what do we need to actually make it real and make it happen? And a huge part of that is giving it the visibility and the resources, and that comes with assigning executive offices and executive C-suite level folks to be able to oversee these offices and really have all that is necessary to start really taking a crack at making a difference. Because that's another thing, it's intimidating work in the sense that, like any kind of cultural change, it's going to take a long time, right? And that's partly the reason that it's taken a while for us to be here. But just like in I would say probably any area of public service, it's so important to always have that, like, that dream, that ideal, even if it's far-fetched, do not forget that as you're navigating the incremental steps, right? Understanding that we're not going to get tomorrow to like the ultimate ideal that we want, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to take all those, however small they feel, and they're not oftentimes, but just going through those steps that are going to get us a strong foundation to get to a point where things like simple operational technology related things are not an issue, right? And it is really, I think, through cultural change how that shifts, right? When we start getting folks more familiar with, like, being English centric, or like how how we speak about language access even, right? Or bringing more attention to language based bias or like accent discrimination, all of these things that are not oftentimes talked about. And they're so important in the dynamics that someone with limited English proficiency or just someone who speaks another language who's bilingual has to face every day in their lives.
And it's not just differences of culture of origin and North American culture. There's also the culture of the hospital. There's the culture of healthcare. There's the culture of insurance. The concept of HIPAA is unknown, for example, to my family in Brazil, because I mean, all you have to do is be somebody famous who gets in trouble for drunk driving or slapping the maid or something. And there's pictures of the slap mark on the maid's face as the guy is trying to interview somebody coming out of the hospital. There's no privacy laws, especially for celebrities. And so the idea that there is that law protected right to privacy and confidentiality is such a big thing, not for everyone, not just women's health, not just for behavioral health, not just for adolescent health, but for everybody to realize that this condition, this infection, this process is not going to become known within their community, so that they can partner and really participate in their recovery. That assurance is so important. It really makes a difference to a lot of people, and it's just not present in other cultures.
Yeah, and you know, that's yet another thing that I wish that more folks knew outside of language access, right? Like the level of preparation that a medical interpreter has, you know, to understand concerns about privacy and safety of the patient. What are the things that are acceptable and which ones aren't, right? So like you have to become an expert in the human body to be an interpreter. Most people, I mean, it seems obvious once you understand it, but most people don't know this, you know, that the level of expertise in anatomy that you need to have as a medical interpreter goes well beyond what I would say most folks outside this this area of knowledge would understand and or know. And to pair that with other things like being an advocate for your patient, right? Like, which is especially hard, I would say, in a healthcare setting, right? Because those are the moments that are most intimate, most painful in many ways, and difficult to navigate. So I really think it's so important to think about those intersections, not just within healthcare, but you know, in general, in the language access world, and specifically, I would say with language services, just how everything starts with language, right? Like your experience somewhere, or whether you're able to actually follow medical instructions or take ownership of your health starts with language.
And if you don't understand how to properly take your medication, especially if it's multiple meds and it's a complicated protocol, never mind like an organ transplant recipient, right?
Yeah.
Then you may be perceived as non-compliant because you're purposefully not taking it right. And it's not because you're not trying, it's because you never understood.
What you're saying resonates so much with me in the sense that, right, we have sometimes the tendency to place the onus on, you know, patients perhaps, in not thinking like how could we have better equipped them to make a decision for their health or their wellness, right? And of course it comes with language, but also it's again a cultural thing, right? Like understanding that there are cultural barriers to even how we want to reach folks when it comes to other things like digital divide, like literacy level, other accessibility concerns. And that's another challenging but also wonderful thing about language access. It touches and intersects with so many things, right? With so many, like, you can't really talk about meaningful access to any service, especially talking about government services, if you don't have good language access, right? Like you have to think of your plain language. Obviously, if it's accessible via web, or I mean, and I'm talking about accessible ways to get to information. So there's so many more considerations than just the translation and interpretation, like you said. It's a whole universe with so many ramifications, and that is really the foundation of getting to a point where we're inclusive.
So looking forward, what would you love to see happen? And I'll divide this in half: short term, long term. We kind of know what the vision is, everyone being treated the same way and being able to describe as well as hear and understand what is needed in order to make meaningful steps towards improving their health profile. But in the short term, what needs to happen? I think we need to educate people interested in language access how to better lobby at the local and state level. People who witness things that are civil rights violations should know how to file a civil rights complaint. People who wish to have a norm be normalized within their schools or their community services should be able to understand how you go about approaching city council and state government to get this written into and enacted as law. And I think maybe that's something that we need to start seriously thinking how to train interested people so they can go back and spread that information like bees in a hive in order to make these things happen a little faster. And maybe it's because I'm getting older that I'm getting impatient. But there was a meme on Facebook that really resonated with me. It was a black and white picture with a protest sign, and then the same woman in a color picture with the same sign that had been in her garage for 35 years or so, saying, I can't believe I'm still out there carrying the sign for the same things. So maybe I'm getting impatient in my old age. But what do you think needs to happen in the short term for us to get closer to where we want to be?
I'll say first, Eliana, that I think there's a required level of impatience for advocacy, right? Like we are the ones making it urgent by saying this needs to happen now, right? Like when someone is newly arrived, for example, in New York State, and they need the resources to be able to create a home, and we're talking about like, documents, or to be able to navigate the medical system, like having this law is what is necessary, right? I absolutely believe that, and no, rather I would say that the language access coordinators and agencies they're at are really passionate about providing the services, understanding, that this is a key part of being able to provide their services and fulfilling their mission. But your question was on the short term. I think it certainly starts with education and with awareness and with lifting up leaders, right? So while our mandate at the Office of Language Access here in New York is to oversee the implementation of this law, I see our role as a support one, in the sense that we're here to make sure that agencies have what they need to be able to provide language services and get to language justice. But it also is going to help other states, right? So like being able to point to Hawaii, to New York, and say, look, those guys are doing it. Like, is it perfect? No. Does it matter that it's perfect? No. We should definitely continue to work at it and just, make sure that we're staying in touch with the communities themselves. I think that's a huge part of it, right? There's awareness for everyone to understand that this is a civil right, right? But also for people to know that they have these rights, right? So we need to make sure that everyone out there in New York State, in our case, knows that the office is here, that this law exists and that the agencies welcome them. It starts with knowing, oh, I can go to any of these state agencies and ask for their services and benefits, and they can provide an interpreter and translated documents in the top languages. Like that knowledge, I think, is key. First of all, the knowledge beyond people who may not speak English very well serves as allyship, which is so necessary, and again got us here. And I think in the long term, that is going to create belonging, which is the end, or really the optimum thing we want to achieve here. Yes, for folks to get great language services, but beyond that, it's when you don't have to think twice before going to get any kind of service, and because you may need to ask for an interpreter, how will they feel about it? Like, for that not to happen anymore, right? So the culture for it to be, not only am I going to get what I need, it's going to be great, and I'm going to continue to feel that I belong, and that there is a place for me, and that I'm celebrated here. That's where we want to get. Oh, I can't hear you, mute.
And for people to stop using their young children in their family as interpreters, because
unacceptable. 100%.
My first on the job experience for my grandmother, and that needs to stop. I still see it happening.
That is incredible and should definitely not be happening. And to your point, there's really, I think, two things there. One is, of course, the legal framework for it, but also the education behind it, right? Because sometimes that's a tipping point where when you have someone see the story of someone who has had to interpret for a family member, their vision of things, I think, changes very quickly, right? To just imagine yourself in the shoes of a child having to give healthcare, deal with the pressure and the needing to provide an interpretation, which is a professional thing to develop over the years, to put all of that on a child, of course, and even on any family member, obviously, especially egregious on children, but that is not something that should be happening, especially when we have really a wealth of resources now, I can say, especially in New York State, to be able to create this beautiful symbiotic thing. We have linguistic talent. Let's use it. Let's celebrate them. Let's definitely educate folks about the fact that this is absolutely a professional thing, that it takes a while to develop, whether you're an interpreter or a translator, or even someone who's communicating in your language, because that still takes the incredible skill of being bilingual, right? I think we need to do a better job also about educating folks about that. And to your point, in things related to be able to promote that, like, how do you navigate conversations about how to change a policy where you work at, right? Who can you go to ask questions about how they started? And I know that there are really so many organisms now, at least more than we had in the last decade or so, that have folks like you and me, that just want to share information, put it out there, and be even the starting point for others who want to do this work and help us get to that language justice ideal.
Precisely. So I hope you are the first of many directors of language access for their entire state to come. And if you are willing, sometime later this year, I would love to try to get you and the representative from Hawaii, who was the only other language access person that I had ever heard of, together for a conversation with the folks from Washington State that run WASCLA, which is Washington State Language Access Coalition. No,
cooperative, maybe.
Access, yes.
Yes.
To see how we can get this rocking in more places.
I would absolutely love that.
Convince the big boys, right? So
I would be delighted and honored to do that. And I have to say again that the Office of Language Access at Hawaii has been so generous with the Office of Language Access at New York State. AP, their executive director, is just such a wonderful practitioner and just such a cool guy. So I would be delighted to be in any and all stages with him.
Well, that's I think a wonderful stopping point for us today, in that it won't be goodbye, it will be hasta luego, até logo in my language.
Hasta pronto.
Thank you so much for joining.
Muchísimas gracias,
I really
Eliana.
enjoyed our conversation, and I can't wait to do it again. And thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of Interpreting in Healthcare. Join us again next month, and we'll discuss what's new and what's happening and how to keep improving as we interpret for healthcare. Gracias otra vez, Margarita.
Gracias.
Chao,
Gracias, Eliana.
chao.